everybody should take it very seriously when the son of Robert F. Kennedy is coming out now and saying that he thinks, Sirhan Sirhan should be paroled. And he's also saying things, according to you, about a lot of different potential national security state assassinations. And he's even said things about Martin Luther King, which, as you just mentioned, Martin Luther King was assassinated only a few months before Robert Kennedy was. But I think we should probably move into the Martin Luther King assassination now. In 1958, someone actually tried to assassinate MLK with a knife. The doctors told him the knife went so close to severing his aorta that if he had, quote, sneezed, he would have died. So the day before he was actually assassinated on April 3rd, 1968, in King's last speech, which is commonly referred to as "I've been on the mountaintop" speech,
Right.
he mentioned not only this incident, and there were some famous lines from it, but he also mentioned that a bomb threat was actually made at the event that he was actually at doing his last speech. And I just wanted to quote him here. He says, "I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation and interstate travel." And then he continues on in his speech to talk about, he's directly referencing the bomb threat that was made against the event itself. So it's just fascinating how much Martin Luther King would talk about this kind of stuff, up until the day before he was actually assassinated. And on the next day, on April 4th, the official story says that Martin Luther King was shot with a single bullet, and it was pretty much instantly fatal. He went immediately unconscious after he was shot around 6:01 p.m. And, the official story again says that witnesses saw a man named James Earl Ray fleeing from the scene of a so-called flop house across the street from the hotel Martin Luther King was staying at. And the police, tracked down the man's identity, allegedly by finding a package dumped close to this flop house, which coincidentally and very conveniently for the police included a rifle and binoculars that had James Earl Ray's fingerprints on it. How did they find Ray in the first place? Apparently, he also bought this gun under an alias. So, how did they originally trace him to this, assassination?
Well, they're not able to. The information that you have, that you mentioned, is how they figure out, oh, it's this guy James Earl Ray. But then he's not caught. He's not caught for a few months. He is able to somehow make it. He makes it all the way to Great Britain, and he's using this alias. And it's according to Philip Melanson, the academic, and Peter Dale Scott. This is the key to how he's able to get away for so long. He uses an alias that's Eric S. Galt, and this alias happens to be the alias of this guy who is built really similarly to Ray. He kind of looks like Ray, and Ray had undergone plastic surgery in 1967, and after that he looked even more like this guy.
Wait a second. That's something that's just too bizarre to not ask about. So, why is there any explanation for why he underwent plastic surgery? Was he already trying to pose as change his identity, previous to this incident?
Yeah, he had a strange escape from prison that seems to have been aided, in some way by some forces. And then he goes and gets plastic surgery. And after this plastic surgery, it does something to his nose and nose and chin, I think, and it makes him look more like this guy who he's never met, Eric S. Galt. And Eric S. Galt is part of the national security establishment because he does this classified work. He has a high security clearance for Union Carbide in Canada and the U.S., working on proximity fuses. So sort of for the military-industrial complex, or defense firms, but in conjunction with the government. And so he's using this this name on his Alabama license, his car registration at a motel in Memphis, and this helps. This triggers the national security state into like not putting out all these efforts into trying to catch him, because it seems to set them into a panic mode of sorts. This is according to Peter Dale Scott, who's looked into this. And so he couldn't have really chosen this alias himself, but it's never been determined like how this happened. He said that Ray's explanation of these things is that he had this handler, a guy named Raoul, who who encouraged him to go here and there and work these jobs and make some money, and that's why he was in Memphis in the first place. And so he's using this name. He makes it all the way to London. So he gets like he's able to leave the country, go to London, and then eventually he gets caught there. So the way that Melanson wrote about it was, the question arises as to how a sophisticated assassination conspiracy, clever enough to match Ray and Galt was the alias that he used, kill King and guide Ray through Toronto, could be inept enough to allow him to be captured alive in London. Okay, and Melanson just said, well, they bungle things in the real world. But Peter Dale Scott's answer was that it wasn't bungling. It was that Ray was meant to be captured, but only at such time as this apparent feat of justice would counter the atrocity of Robert Kennedy's murder. In this way, Ray's capture served to offset the popular anger and frustration which produced such violent days of rioting after the murder of Martin Luther King. So that's Peter Dale Scott's analysis, and I can't say that I know enough about the case to really add anything to that, but the timing of all of these assassinations and the fact that we are meant to just accept them as these random acts, but not even random acts by people who said they were swept up in the emotions of the time. These are, in both cases, the people are saying they didn't do it for any particular reason. Sirhan eventually said, yeah, I guess I did it. But then in James Earl Ray's case, he said, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I don't have any reason to do it.
We hear all the time about the FBI sending MLK that letter urging him to kill himself. Of course, the widespread surveillance from the FBI and also the CIA on MLK and his personal life. But why is this never talked about? The fact that Coretta Scott King, did this civil trial in 1999, and just talk about that, and also what evidence is there that James Earl Ray is not the perpetrator?
Well, when you say why it's not talked about, I think because if to cast doubt on the official version and to raise suspicions of the state being involved, that really cuts to the legitimacy of the state. I mean, even Republican presidents have to pay honor Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day.
It's like as far as they'll go is just to say, oh yeah, they sent him a letter telling him to kill himself. Right.
They'll write about that in the New York Times, but and it'll be chalked up as like, oh, the FBI was, and their Cold War hysteria. They thought everyone was influenced by the communists. But Hoover did similar things. In the way back in like 1919, Hoover was the guy behind the first Red Scare that, deported Emma Goldman and destroyed the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. So it didn't take the Cold War to get him to act that way. But I think that because it's so damning to the establishment to think that they would have killed somebody like this, that they have to deny it. And if you go to Snopes, which I don't really recommend for any of these controversial things, but there's actually a page where somebody put it to Snopes. Is it true that a jury found, a civil trial found that a conspiracy was behind the death of Martin Luther King? And Snopes answers it as mostly false. And the reasoning is basically that they don't like the verdict, and so it's mostly false. So, but it's here. It's categorically true that happened. There was a civil trial, and they mustered enough evidence, and they had a guy who admitted to being a part of the conspiracy and to taking like $100,000 to be a part of it. They had a lot of testimony, and it only took the jury like an hour to say like, yeah, there was a conspiracy. Now there were elements of the trial that weren't perfect, but because it wasn't quite as adversarial. But the thing is, they presented a lot of evidence that, that there was military intelligence on the ground in Memphis that couldn't really be explained, that there was police misconduct and the destruction of evidence, that James Earl Ray had seemed, that he didn't seem to be having any motive to do it. There were a lot of reasons for them to come back with that verdict. And they just can't, they can't admit that happened. Now, there's other evidence that has been used to look at the case. Part of it is the ballistics of the rifle, that the rifle had a really badly aligned scope. Judge Joe Brown, who later had a TV show, he was supposed to look into reopening the case, and he was leaning towards doing that, and had, I think, essentially decided to do that. He just needed to write up, the right sort of opinions or judgments in order to reopen the case, because he knew something about firearms, and he had looked at the firearm that they had in question as evidence, and found that that he couldn't have done that. The firearm in question couldn't have done this. The one in evidence couldn't have been used. But when he goes on vacation, which is a routine thing for a judge to do, they take a very unusual step of moving the case to another judge, and the judge denies Ray a new trial. And so he was denied another trial because of that. So there's, besides the ballistic evidence that Joe Brown was persuaded by, you have things that Doug Valentine discovered when he was researching the Phoenix program. He went around and interviewed people who'd been part of the CIA's assassination program in Vietnam, the Phoenix program, and some of them, one of them at least, and I think more than one, it said that they were in Memphis, that they'd been called into Memphis on the days that King was killed, like right around the time that King was killed, that they were there when King was killed. And there's never been an explanation for this. Why are you calling in military intelligence, people with experience in assassination, to Memphis, Tennessee, when Martin Luther King is there?
Well, I always found it odd that we were perfectly okay with accepting the fact that the CIA was running an assassination program all around the world and involved in all of these overt, activities, overthrowing, usurping the democratic processes of countless countries. Yet it was completely out of the question to entertain that notion was happening within our own nation.
Yeah, that's the heart of it right there. I think that what kind of threat was Salvador Allende to the United States, and he ended up dead? Okay, who's more threatening, Salvador Allende or the Kennedy brothers? Who want to end the Cold War?
Or Martin Luther King, said to be the most dangerous Negro in the nation.
Right, and who is trying to mobilize a movement to call specifically for doing two things that they are very opposed to: ending the very lucrative war in Vietnam and spending money on social programs in the United States, which have since that time period have been cut drastically as a percentage of GNP. We've moved in the opposite direction. I think in part as a response to the 1960s, really, and the political activism of that day. Both parties are now firmly corporate pro-war, and I think that things have been managed in such a particular way as to make America less democratic since that time period, so that it seems that politicians like Kennedy and leaders like King, they don't have the influence that they once had.
Why do you think people aren't willing to entertain that more? Is it just the ethnocentrism, nationalism, jingoism? What is it?
I think it's, for most people, well, a lot of people, you say, like, when you have only 11% of the public believing in the Warren Commission in 1976, a lot of people have entertained it, and we know the elites did. It's just that in the media, there's been such unanimity, and in the public statements of officials, they've been afraid to confront it. Not always. There were some, like Schweiker, the senator from Pennsylvania. He came to basically the same conclusion as Oliver Stone as far as who was guilty of it. And he was a Republican. He was almost going to be Ronald Reagan's vice president. So people have spoken out about these things and tried to investigate them, but they run into massive resistance. And the sheer amount of propaganda that you see it in little bursts now, where all the reporting on, say, Venezuela just comes out. And if you follow the case, if you follow the recent history and even the current events, that they're lying about these things. and yet they can present such a united front that it's really more effective than having a state-run propaganda agency would be. It's the way that the corporate media can all sing from the same, hymn book on these issues is, I think, allows them an enormous amount of control over the discourse.
And even websites like you mentioned, Snopes, and let's talk about Wikipedia really quickly. I mean, you go to Wikipedia, whether it be Project Censored, Peter Joseph, or me, you have an immediate kind of redefinition of who we are as lunatic fringe conspiracy theorists because we've dared to question these very things. And that's really interesting because people go to these websites for this kind of unbiased arbitration of, like, who are these people? And they just want like a snapshot. But these are also controlled.
The freedom that was promised by the internet it's been folded back into the sort of dominant narratives in a lot of ways. It's Google, Facebook, Wikipedia. They're useful for things that are not controversial. You can find reliable information on uncontroversial topics, but for things that are controversial, you get the narrative that you're most likely to get if you don't know where to look is the dominant narrative of the the power structure and their sort of version of the world that they want everyone to believe in.
It's just so gross that these are conflated with completely absurd conspiracy theories like Pizzagate, where now you hear kind of truther is now equated to just being someone who is a flat earther or something.
Oh right, yeah, truth.
Grotesque.
The word truth has been sort of bastardized in a way. Like it now is associated with its opposite. It's really Orwellian to the extreme. But even, Lance, you guys have read Lance's book, Lance David Smith's book, Conspiracy Theory in America, and he writes a lot about the nonsensical way the word conspiracy theory is used. Yes. And I would just point out now that if you look at the U.S. since World War II, our entire national security posture has been, organized around conspiracy theories. First, the global communist conspiracy, which they would literally, they use that word, the global communist conspiracy, for a long time. And they use it less once conspiracy theory becomes associated with the Kennedy assassination. Then you don't hear it as much, but it still is a conspiracy theory. And then there's the conspiracy theory, the global war on terror, that we basically need to allow the state to have enormous power of surveillance and, to kill people all over the globe wherever that needs to be done because of the terrorist conspiracy. And then now it's Russia. The Russians are conspiring constantly. Only because the word conspiracy has been, discredited because they want to discourage people from thinking of state crimes, it doesn't even get called a conspiracy. They'll use the word, collusion or something.
Now they're even trying to say that the conspiracy theories in and of themselves are being planted by Russia to divide to divide our country.
They even called the Venezuela coup a Russian talking point. That's where we're at.
Right.
Well, let's get back just a little bit into some of the details about the MLK assassination and what actually caused this civil trial, Coretta Scott King versus Lloyd Jowers. Who is Lloyd Jowers, the owner of this so-called flop house that was across the street from the hotel MLK was assassinated in? Why is there a reason to believe Lloyd Jowers was actually credible about what he had to say about his role in the MLK assassination?
Well, he was dying of cancer, and he approached, maybe it was William Pepper or the King family, and his story came, they did stories on like 2020 about it. He was really a low level, organized crime figure who ran this flop house and this little diner in Memphis, and he wasn't a reputable figure because, people who'd be in assassination plots might not be. But he had no reason really to lie. They've tried to say he was doing this for financial gain, but I've never really found that to be too persuasive. But of course, they're going to try to say something like that. But he was dying. He didn't live much past the trial. In fact, he might have been dead by the end of it, but if he wasn't, he didn't live much past it. And he was there, and what his story was that he was given $100,000 to participate in this crime, and that he took a gun from someone who had actually shot MLK and helped to frame James Earl Ray, and that Ray had been staying in the flop house that he ran. So the King family believed him. He was a witness at that trial, and a defendant as well. He was the one that they actually sue in the trial. The King family sues Jowers because that's the way they're able to get their day in court.
Yeah.
And he knows this, and he's fine with it because he wants to bring these facts, to light. I think as he's dying, and over decades it becomes clear the historical significance of this, and he wants to do something about it.
And they originally sued him for $10 million, but almost more of it was like a symbolic thing, and they ended up, when they won, only making him pay something like $100.
Right.
Because I think
that sounds right.
Because William Pepper said this wasn't about the money. This is about the the disclosures.
Right, and Pepper was not Pepper, who was the lawyer for James Earl Ray, and he's also Sirhan's lawyer now. He was a guy who was really active in peace movements and such, and he knew Martin Luther King. He's actually the person who you could probably say turned Martin Luther King against the war in Vietnam. He showed him an early version of this story that he was writing for Ramparts magazine, which was a great magazine in the 60s that dealt with the issues we're talking about now, and there's no magazine like it today. And he showed him these pictures of the people that he had seen in Vietnam, and they brought King to tears, really. And he said after that he couldn't continue to support the war anymore. And so, he turned against the war 1 year to the day before he got assassinated.
And since that trial, I mean, what's interesting about that trial is we're talking a little bit about how mainstream media and this unanimity of media has essentially conditioned people into believing that these are crazy conspiracy theories, to believe that the national security state actually was behind the assassinations of these figures. But interestingly, ABC News, Bryant Gumbel actually gave Coretta Scott King an interview after the trial, and it was sort of a fair piece. I mean, the piece for the most part was not really doubting a lot of the stuff that came out in the trial, but these stories just sort of disappear, once they come out in mainstream media. Like this thing about Robert Mayhew that you were just talking about having to do with potentially being behind RFK's assassination was in the Washington Post. And then it's just sort of barely talked about after that. So it's interesting that it does eke through into the mainstream media sometimes, but it still doesn't really matter because Coretta Scott King and other surviving King family members, including Dexter King, tried to lobby then President Bill Clinton after the civil trial concluded to reopen the investigation and have a new legal trial, but they were ignored or turned down. Do you know exactly what transpired there? Like if they actually were even able to get a message to Bill Clinton?
Yeah, when Bill Clinton was approached by, it may have been Coretta personally who did it, and he says something to the effect of, "We'll look into it." This is how I remember it anyway. And that he says something to the effect of, "We'll look into it," and then there's never any action or further inquiry from the Clinton Justice Department. And I mean, nobody there could have possibly had anything to do with it personally. So, I mean, the reasons for them not wanting to go back into it is purely to protect the institution.
Same reason Obama didn't want to prosecute or investigate, rather even war crimes, torture. It's like it's just an unraveling thread of complicity.
Right. And where do you go with that? But they've made an effort recently. We didn't talk about this, so I should mention it. That just a few months ago, a couple months, there's a petition released or a statement released by a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and it was signed by a lot of people, including academics, Hollywood types, and different researchers that have looked into the case. Some of the more interesting ones are this guy named Blakey, G. Robert Blakey. He was the head of the second investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And in the past, they had arrived at the conclusion that it was actually a conspiracy to kill the president, and that it was carried out by people he didn't know who, but perhaps mafia and anti-Castro Cubans. Well, he's now signed on to this statement that's a joint statement on the Kennedy, King, and Malcolm X assassinations. That's both of the Kennedy assassinations, calling for, calling on the new Democratic Congress to look into these cases and attempt to have an investigation and a public discussion of, all of the evidence that's been turned up over the years, and to attempt to look at their effect on American democracy and America's history. It was signed by Daniel Ellsberg as well, Oliver Stone, Alec Baldwin, Peter Dale Scott, Mark Crispin Miller, a whole lot of people. One of the doctors, Robert McClellan, who saw Kennedy in the emergency room at Dallas, and described wounds that couldn't have been consistent with Oswald as a shooter. So you can find it at AmericanTruthNow.org. They have the statement up, and that was written about in the Washington Post too. So it's strange that the Post picks it up, but as you say, once these things get reported, if the other news sites don't pick up on them, if the nightly news doesn't pick up on them, the New York Times doesn't do a story, the other newspapers don't, then they just sort of disappear. And that, I hope that's not what happens with this effort, but at least you see that people are still out there trying to get the powers that be to somehow confront our history, because it haunts us, I think, to this day.
Yeah, and according to Wikipedia, the Justice Department also did their own kind of investigation of the civil trial Coretta Scott King versus Lloyd Jowers, and they rejected it because they said there was a lack of evidence. Do you know anything about that, and who was in charge of that the government taking the baton and then just throwing it out?
Right. It would have been the Clinton Justice Department, but to get back to where we started with, what that amounts to really is the accusation that there has been a state crime, a state crime against democracy in this case. It's a state crime, and then the state has investigated and found itself to be innocent. I mean, that's essentially how it happens.
Investigation concluded.
Right, and that is, it seems to be a catch, it's a catch-22. It's something, I don't know, if without a big public movement for it, or without some sort of shift among some elites, that our current system is failing, and that maybe one way to reorient our political, the political consciousness of the nation would be to go back and look at these things. It's difficult to see how they're going to be adjudicated, which is to say that it's up to people who are concerned about the truth, maybe for just the sake of the truth, to keep talking about these things, because I personally think that we face a number of crises, like the corruption of our political system, this empire that can't really continue to work the way that it has, the nuclear issue and the global warming issue, which both of those threaten human civilization. That a move in a progressive direction would actually be beneficial for even our elites, and would they come to realize that they have to delegitimize the prevailing order before any sort of, change could be made that is necessary for all humans? Maybe that is a way that we would start to look at these kind of crimes and look at our history and see where we went wrong, and, try to come up with some way to address these things.
Well, one of the disturbing things that comes to mind for me about getting some kind of truth and reconciliation about any of these events is that it seems like there's always a new event. We didn't even get any truth and reconciliation really about RFK, JFK, or MLK by the time 9/11 happened. And, how many years is it going to be before we have truth and reconciliation about that, which is, one of the most ultimate examples of a state crime against democracy. But just so people out there, people who are still skeptical, who think, oh, maybe, this is so fringe, or, or of course the family would, not believe this, and they're biased, or like, I don't know what logic people would use to write off a lot of the things we've talked about today, but can you go into any other high profile politicians or other famous people, celebrities, any famous public figures who also agree that James Earl Ray was not MLK's assassin? I know you already mentioned Daniel Ellsberg and even, actors like Alec Baldwin, who's kind of surprising to me because seems like such a generic, liberal, but, or who out there who would maybe surprise people has actually gone out there and suggested the U.S. government assassinated people like MLK or JFK or even RFK?
Well, there were two. There's the two family. You said the family members are like maybe not going to be as persuasive to people. There were, besides Robert Kennedy Jr., you have Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who is also he's the daughter of Robert Kennedy. You have Cyril Wecht, who runs this, I think it's Duquesne University. There's like the Cyril Wecht Center for Forensics. He's like maybe America's most illustrious forensic pathologist. And he's done all this work on the Kennedy assassinations, but also he's looked at, the Kennedy assassinations, both of them. And he has signed onto this statement. You have John Newman, who is, a former Army intelligence officer who's a history professor now at James Madison University. You have Kennedy's own doctor, John Kennedy's doctor, whose name was Berkeley. He's the guy that wrote the death certificate. And he tried to contact Congress when they were reinvestigating it in the 70s, and he said, nobody ever interviewed me. I have information to the effect that Kennedy couldn't have been killed by Oswald, and I'd like to testify. They never follow up on it. They weren't interested. So he was Kennedy's personal doctor, saw him in the as he was dying in Dallas, and was probably already dead really, and they didn't want to hear it. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France, never believed this. Charles de Gaulle was almost killed in a very similar event. He was driving his Citroen, or he was being driven around, and he drives into this crossfire, and they shoot up his car. He's able to get away barely. Well, it turns out it was his own intelligence service that had done it. The group called the OAS that had formed this fringe right-wing, terror or terrorist group they'd become, or that then they wanted to kill de Gaulle because they weren't in favor of his policies, decolonizing in Africa, Algeria, and so they tried to kill him. De Gaulle found evidence that the CIA was involved in this, and this was reported in France. So he calls Kennedy and asks him, was the CIA, were you guys trying to kill me? And Kennedy says, well, I wasn't trying to kill you, but I don't really have control of my intelligence agencies. So
it's like, we can't be sure. And maybe they tried to kill
exactly.
You.
And Kennedy himself, if you've ever seen the movie 7 Days in May, it's like this old movie that came out around the time of the Kennedy assassination. It's about a bunch of right-wing generals, and they're afraid that the president is going to negotiate a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, and so they plot to overthrow him. They plot to overthrow the president. And Kennedy read the book, and he said, that could happen here. After things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, if you kept doing things like that, they could actually do it. And so he arranged for the people filming that movie to be able to shoot it at the White House when he was out of town. So
wow.
They filmed scenes like out in front of the White House. So Kennedy himself believed that it was quite possible that an assassination or a coup, an overthrow of the president could take place by these cold warriors, these fanatics. And in the newspapers, a couple, like maybe August of 1963, there's a highly placed source who isn't named, but it disappears in the New York Times even. And this official said, if there's ever a 7 Days in May, it'll come from the CIA, not the Pentagon. And it's talking about how unaccountable the CIA is. And it says, in like August of 1963, that, if there's ever a government overthrow, it's from the CIA, and they're totally out of control. The president can't control them in Vietnam and elsewhere. So there's reasons that to believe that Kennedy even thought that this was a possibility.